Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Mark Hendrickson, one of the directors of Florida Alpha, and I want to welcome everyone who is joining our second session of this year's educational conference, Federal Legislative Update. Before we start and I turn it over to Sherry Gully, I want to briefly thank our sponsors of the conference. And if you could just run through those slides, Lisa, but for me you can just keep rolling through them. But our platinum level or the Broward, Escambia, Hillsborough, Jacksonville, Lee, Miami-Dade, and Pinellas HFAs, along with Dominion, eHousing, RBC Capital, and Raymond James. Thanks also to our gold sponsors who are listed there, and also to our breakfast and silver sponsors. Thank you very much. When you see these people in person, please thank them. Without their support, the conference would not be, we would not be able to offer this as a free service to all of our Florida Alpha members. Before we turn it to Sherry for this session, Lisa, if you could go through a few of the ground rules of how we're going to operate today.
Absolutely. And so just wanted to let you know that all participants will be muted at the start of the discussion. We are going to, if you need to ask a question, we're going to ask that you put it in the chat box, and Mark will make sure that it goes, that it gets answered. And just to let you know, we are going to be recording this session. It will be posted on the conference website. I just want to point you back to our conference website at floridaalphaconference.org. And there you will see our virtual exhibitors, our virtual exhibit hall. We just added another exhibit booth. Want you to go there, check in. Make sure to check in at the beginning of the virtual exhibit hall, and you will be entered to win some prizes. So thank you to all of our virtual exhibitors for participating, and make sure to check out their exhibit booths.
Great. Well, thank you, Lisa, and we'll turn it over to Sherry Gully for today's panel. Thanks.
Thanks, Mark. Hello, and welcome to the next session titled Federal Legislative Update. My name is Sherry Gully, and I'm the Executive Director of the Miami-Dade Housing Finance Authority. I will be the moderator of this session. As everyone knows, the past year has been packed with activity in Washington, ranging from COVID relief to the inauguration of a new administration, and 2021 is looking to be another busy year. For this session, we have the Executive Director and the Director of Government Affairs of the National Association of Local Housing Finance Agencies with us. They will dive into the past year's activity on housing policy and give us some insider analysis on what we can expect this year, ranging from fair housing regulations, comprehensive infrastructure legislation, reforms to the housing credit, and others. So joining us today, first, we're going to have Jonathan Payne. He's the Executive Director of the National Association of Local Housing Finance Agencies, NALFA, who will provide us some brief introductory remarks, and then we'll move forward from there. Jonathan.
Thank you so much, Sherry. I wanted to take this opportunity to thank all of you for taking the time to join us this afternoon. I want to, of course, thank Florida Alpha and, of course, Mark Hendrickson for allowing us this opportunity to speak with all of you, and for the outstanding job that he does in the state of Florida and representing the industry there. We greatly value our partnership with Florida Alpha, and if we can ever be of any assistance, please do not hesitate to contact us. Kevin and I are here to support all of you and Mark in your efforts as well in representing you here in Washington, D.C. on federal matters. I know many of you are members of NALFA, and I thank you for your continued support. For those of you who may not be as familiar with NALFA and would be interested in learning more and having a conversation with me about membership, I welcome that opportunity, of course. So please feel free to reach out to me, and I'm happy to have conversations with anyone one-on-one about NALFA. And even if you are a member and you have some feedback or insights or ideas or suggestions on how we can better serve you, we love to hear from you as well. Lastly, I did want to take this opportunity to share the dates of our next 2 annual conferences. We are excited to get back to having some in-person events. As many of you know, we were supposed to be in New York last year and in Florida this year. That obviously got sidetracked with the pandemic, but we're happy that we were able to renegotiate those agreements for future years. So the NALFA 2022 annual conference will be held from April 24th to 27th in New York City. And happy to announce and share that the NALFA 2023 annual conference will be held from May 3rd to May 6th in Tampa at the JW Marriott. We are definitely excited to get back to Florida, and we'll be working with Mark and many of you to ensure a fantastic event in Florida in 2023. Thank you again to Mark for the invitation and all of you. I will turn it back over to Sherry to begin the rest of the program.
Thanks, Jonathan. Now we're going to bring Kevin McKinney forward to have a discussion today, an update on issues. Kevin McKinney has served as the Director of Government Affairs, Business and Trade Industry Practice at Smith Buckland, an association management company, for over 5 years. Kevin is a registered lobbyist in the federal legislative and regulatory arena and is one of the company's senior advocacy professionals. Kevin's issue portfolio has included a wide range of housing issues, ranging from policy on residential construction to the low-income housing tax credit. Over his career, Kevin has developed and strengthened critical relationships, not only with congressional offices, but also at federal agencies. Welcome, Kevin.
Thank you very much. Great to be here.
Great to have you. So today, Kevin, I would like to for us to have a discussion about some critical issues. So what I wanted to do was lead in with some questions and for us to start the discussion, if you would. The past year contained a tremendous amount of activity, ranging from the COVID pandemic and subsequent relief legislation to the inauguration of a new administration. Can you provide some brief insight into the past year from the perspective of housing policy?
Sure. Thank you, Sherry. And thank you to Florida ALHFA for having me. I want to echo Jonathan that we're really thrilled to be here to speak with all of you about these issues. Boy, what a question to think about the last year and all of the stuff that was kind of going on. What I thought I would do, I think a lot of the information that we'll cover regarding the past year will be stuff that most people are familiar with, but it probably will be good to tee up, where we are now and look at 2021. So just kind of a brief look back to Sherry's point is a great idea. So really where I think a lot of things really started to change in the context of moving away from the traditional process of housing policy, where the appropriations process was really a big path forward to the critical programs that we all advocate for. Really, when the COVID pandemic hit and there started to be all the discussion about relief legislation is where advocacy organizations like NALFA and others really kicked into gear to advocate strongly for several housing provisions. So just briefly, going back even to the CARES Act, that was technically it was the third relief bill passed by Congress, but it was really the first that had really significant provisions in it to help deal with the pandemic. And that was ranging from things like rental assistance to even things like that were related to business, like the Paycheck Protection Program and helping businesses keep people on their payroll. So during this period of time, starting around March, is when NALFA and others started to really get into high gear on advocating for several programs like that. So after the CARES Act was passed, then of course we had the implementation period of many of those programs that we were working pretty closely with other organizations as well to see that the Treasury Department, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, even the Small Business Administration in some cases, were really pushing out guidance and making sure that the public and our members in particular were able to get timely guidance and information about how to utilize all of the relief programs that were being passed. after the CARES Act was passed and we started to get into the subsequent months of 2020, there were some additional relief provisions that would extend certain programs, even things like unemployment benefits. As one example, as everybody remembers, there was the $600 supplemental unemployment insurance each week. It was originally passed at $600 per week in addition to base unemployment benefits. That was extended by Congress a few times. It's now, of course, extended at the $300 mark. So all of these things were being discussed and considered throughout 2020. What I really want to make an observation about is looking into the work that NALFA did and some others, particularly from the summer into the fall, is looking at some opportunities that were going to come up with some additional COVID legislation, which would pave the way for some additional NALFA priorities. One of them, of course, and we're going to talk about this, I think, a little bit later. Sherry has a good question on this later, but the Affordable Housing Tax Credit bill, that's the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act, which, of course, I think everybody's familiar with. It makes several changes to the low-income housing tax credit. That was something that we teamed up with several others to advocate for, to include in a relief bill in December. Now, the full bill did not make it into that legislation, but we did see, excuse me, that permanent 4% rate, which was a big victory, of course, for the industry. And so that took us right into 2021. And right from there, we started seeing a new administration. And that's going to be, I know, a topic coming up soon as well. So the last year was definitely unique in the context that so many programs that are big priorities for the industry and things that definitely were very, very important and crucial to many, many people in the United States. That really changed a lot of things starting around that March timeframe. Whereas, as I mentioned, a lot of the traditional process for these things were through the congressional appropriations route. And so that brings us into to 2021, into a new administration. And so with that, Shari, I hope that answers that question, and happy to talk about a new administration and all that coming up.
Yeah, that would be great, Kevin. I know as you were leading into 2021, we do have this new administration. President Biden is in office. It's been about 5 months now. We have the new HUD Secretary, Marcia Fudge. So can you speak to us on the president's first few months and from a policy perspective, what's going on particularly at HUD?
Yeah, so the last few months for the Biden administration, I'd say have been, from NALFA's perspective, pretty positive so far. There are several things that we were looking at both in the beginning of the administration and then more recently, things that we've seen that are very positive and very optimistic for both the industry and for the crucial affordable housing programs that we support. So looking earlier into the administration, when the president was first inaugurated, he immediately started going to work on the typical things that do come up in administration, staffing a cabinet, hiring those people. So that was, of course, in the works. But he was also going to work right away on some of the other things that we were seeing as positive. Perfect example was some of the executive orders that the president was looking at signing in the beginning. One of them, for example, was the reinstatement of AFFH. That's something that NALFA has had as a priority for some time since the previous administration's actions on that. So that was a big indicator that he was going to make housing a priority. And that was in line with the things that he'd be talking about, both at the kind of the more end of his campaign, but definitely as he was inaugurated. He really made a very strong commitment to affordable housing and housing programs. And in addition to that, we can talk more about this coming up, but there's definitely a holistic approach to housing that the Biden administration is taking. There's support for the traditional, very important critical housing programs that we all support. But then there's some other proposals too that have come up under President Biden that really have not that they haven't been proposed before, but they just bring in some additional aspects of housing that weren't considered before. A perfect example is looking at incentives to upgrade the energy efficiency of a home in affordable housing. So that's a perfect example of looking at some additional things that would have the potential to really benefit people and we're going to talk a little bit more about that in the context of infrastructure, I know. So we'll touch on that. So that's one thing is the early commitment to housing and the executive order on AFFH, the appointment, as you mentioned, of Marcia Fudge as the Secretary of HUD has been very positive. We've been able to have a couple discussions with HUD so far since Marcia Fudge has been sworn in and confirmed. And they're really fired up about housing. It seems like they're really looking at working directly with Congress right now to try to get several really crucial housing programs put forward in a potential comprehensive infrastructure bill. That seems to be a really good potential vehicle for a lot of the priorities that that we have. So her department has been very positive. And the other thing, and we'll talk a little bit more about this as well, is I mentioned AFFH on the executive order, but I think as people know, there was the recent announcement on AFFH that will go back into effect July 31st. There's going to be a short comment period. NALFA plans to weigh in on that with just signaling our support for HUD in the reinstatement of AFFH. But so there's the actual executive order, but then we're seeing actual action, being taken by the administration, which has been very positive. And so that's definitely due to President Biden and Secretary Fudge on that. And so, those are some of the main things. There's also, I'll mention one more thing, is disparate impact is another one that NALFA is a supporter of. And we did just see the announcement from HUD that disparate impact will be brought back as well. So another positive sign there on the commitment to housing. And then I think shortly we're going to talk a little bit about some more specific numbers. So looking forward to get into that, which I think will give some additional context to the president's support for housing programs.
Okay, if we then could go from there to the president's budget request to Congress, and if you would discuss then the appropriations process, and as you mentioned, you can get into some of those numbers there.
Sure, absolutely. For everybody's kind of organization and benefit, I'm going to go ahead and share a slide here that'll just help to organize some of the numbers. So here on the screen, hopefully everybody can see that slide. It should say housing provisions in. Actually, it's the next slide, right? This one, housing provisions in Biden budget request. So what I wanted to show is kind of to provide some visual organization of the president's budget. Now, just a word about the budget request. I think these are things that I'm sure many people know, but just for some additional background, the president each year provides a budget request to Congress. Now, this is essentially a request, and that's the key word. Of course, because Congress allocates money for the federal government, they're the ones who take over, and all that process goes through the Appropriations Committee. But for the president, they kind of give another way to describe it is kind of a wish list, right? So they'll say, here are the things that in our estimation we should be funding. Here are the requests that we're making for you as Congress to allocate money. So it's not a binding document at all. It's more of a request to Congress. So with that being said, I wanted to pull out a few specifics from the Biden budget request. And this deals with everything ranging from defense to housing to energy related issues. It covers really everything, but a few interesting numbers here. Tenant-based rental assistance, he's requesting $30.4 billion. Project-based rental assistance, $14 billion. Money for homelessness assistance, $3.5 billion. Energy efficient upgrades in affordable housing. That was one thing I was talking about. That's $800 million. $3.5 billion for public housing. For the home investment partnerships, that's $1.85 billion. CDBG, $3.8 billion. Rural rent housing, $1.45 billion. So these are kind of a snapshot of the numbers that the president is requesting. And I can say that they're all actually increases for funding for all of these programs from previous levels. And the interesting thing I want to note about that is the fiscal year 2022 budget is, so the fiscal year 2022 appropriations that come out of Congress, that's going to be the first year where the federal government is not bound by the confines of the Budget Control Act. So many of you will probably remember back during the immediate stages of the 2008-2009 economic crisis, President Obama came to an agreement with congressional Republicans at the time to pass what's called the Budget Control Act, and it was in exchange for raising the debt ceiling. One of the things they had to commit to was to keep federal spending at certain levels for 10 years in exchange for the raising of the debt limit. So up until fiscal year 2021, the federal government was restrained by the details of the Budget Control Act. And one of the things that did was it had a negative impact on the ability for critical housing programs to receive the funding that, in our estimation, that they would need. So again, the government was constrained by that piece of legislation. So in fiscal year 2022, this will be the first year that the Budget Control Act is not in effect and will not bind the federal government. So the president here is, I think, really trying to take advantage of some opportunities, especially with the Democratic House, Democratic Senate, to really make some substantive investments into really important affordable housing programs. And so this is kind of along the appropriations track. And then, as I mentioned, there's an infrastructure track as well. So I think they're really looking at this as an opportunity year. 2021, I think, for them is really going to be a key year to really make some substantive investments, as I mentioned, in a lot of these programs. So that's a note about the budget request. The next stage in the appropriations process is going to be Congress. So with the president's budget request being submitted to Congress, what happens next is the House and Senate appropriations committees get to work on putting together some appropriations bills. Actually, for those who might have attended the ALHFA conference recently, we had representatives from both the Senate and House appropriations committees who joined us for a panel, which was very insightful. It went into a lot more detail than I certainly could, since they're in the weeds every day on the intricacies of appropriations. So that was a very insightful panel. So they will, they're working on crafting some legislation on congressional appropriations, and then that will get voted on. The traditional process, this is kind of the last point about the congressional process. The traditional process for appropriations is that each department or a few departments get brought together into specific appropriations bills. So in the case of housing, that is under the THUD, the Transportation, Housing, and Urban Development Appropriations Bill. And that bill is a standalone bill separate from, let's say, the defense bill. And Congress is supposed to vote individually on these appropriations bills to fund each of these agencies and the programs that they oversee. Over the last several years, though, the inability of Congress to really craft bipartisan agreements and come together to enact important legislation has forced them to do what are called continuing resolutions. And I'm sure you've heard of that in the news a lot: CRs, continuing resolutions, or even in a couple cases, omnibus spending bills. So these are they're essentially keep the lights on pieces of legislation. They're basically saying, between the Budget Control Act and between our inability to really come together and agree on appropriations, the best thing for us moving forward is just going to be to pass continuing resolutions. It keeps funding stagnant at whatever the current levels are, and just basically says, okay, we can keep spending money, but only according to the levels that are already in place. And so again, that goes back to the issue that we see, which is the inability of Congress to make really important investments and to increase funding in many cases that's needed for a lot of these programs. So all that's to say, that'll be the next step in the appropriations process. We are currently advocating strongly for very substantive and robust investments into these programs. And so we're going to keep continuing to advocate on that, but that'll be the next step in the appropriations process.
Great, thanks. A few minutes ago, you highlighted the AFFH rule. You talked a bit about it. That was a question that I was going to come to you with. So I don't know if you wanted to give us a little bit more of the background on it. You talked about, that we will be looking for a reinstatement of the rule. And you talked about ALHFA's support of the rule. Is there anything that you want Florida Alpha board members to know that we should be doing at this level, that we can be doing to help in that reinstatement?
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. One of the things, well, let me backtrack. The good news is that the administration has concluded that it is going to be, it is official at this point that AFFH will be reinstated. So that's very positive. The initial announcement that they've made on this is, the best way I can describe it is kind of a high level announcement, and there's going to be some additional language coming out from HUD on the details of the implementation of that. So for those who are very passionate about this, one of the things you could do, and I think the comment deadline closes, maybe it's the 10th, I'll have to confirm that date, but it closes in the early part of July. That's the comment deadline for AFFH. For those who are very passionate about it, you're always welcome from the federal government to weigh in with any particular letters, comments in support, things like that. I would note that if you do that, of course, there's no cost or anything like that. If you would like to do that, you should know that it does go into the public record. So it is accessible for everybody to read a comment like that. So it's just good to be mindful that comments, when you're weighing in with the federal government through the rulemaking channels, that those letters are made public. But NALFA will be weighing in support of that. And there'll be some additional detail once HUD comes out with some more specific language on this. But for those who are very passionate and interested, weighing in with a letter of support is always a good idea.
Kevin and Sherry, I think one thing that would be really helpful, because those of us that are into this issue are really into it, but many of the members really aren't familiar with it. Could you explain what the AFFH is, and in a practical sense, what it means for local governments and what they would be required to do under that? At least a general outline of that would be great. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, no problem, Mark. The short version is this relates to the Fair Housing Act. And one of the things that the Fair Housing Act does, that was passed in the late 60s, and HUD HUD and the recipients of funding from HUD to further policies of the Fair Housing Act, those recipients are required to adhere to certain things. One of the things, for example, the obligation, trying to organize my thoughts here a little bit. One of the things they have to do is, for example, there are certain requirements in terms of you can't discriminate, right? So there are particulars around race, national origin, religion, that you cannot discriminate, of course, for housing. AFFH sets particular requirements for if you're receiving HUD funding. It kind of clarifies that with a little bit more detail and specifics about how those funds are allowed to be utilized for purposes of non-discrimination. Sherry, if you have any additional detail or perspectives about.
No, just what you said. So it gives an outline for what locals and what cities and organizations must follow in order to, ensure that, residents are being treated fairly. So that's about it. Mark, does that do it? Do you have any input, Mark?
No, that's great. I just, but it is an important factor that, it makes local governments, not just not discriminate in a passive sense, but they have to, in their expenditures, have a plan to, to affirmatively further fair housing, not just, in the negative, just not overtly discriminate when they do their expenditures.
Right.
And so
Yeah,
it does put a requirement for a little more action on the part of the recipients of all the federal money to be proactive rather than just, not overtly discriminating. But it's a great thing. And it was too bad that it went away for a while. Glad to see it's back. Thanks.
Exactly.
Yep.
Exactly.
Thanks, Mark.
So, Kevin, let's see, where are we going next? I understand there have been some positive developments in for the HUD Federal Financing Bank Risk Sharing Partnership, and which was allowed to expire under the previous administration. Can you give us any updates on that program and talk about any possible reinstatement there? And if you would give us a little background on that as well.
Sure. Yes. So there's some positive news on that. Of course, just for brief background, the FFB HUD Risk Sharing Initiative, it was started back in 2015. This was intended to stimulate affordable housing production and was kind of in response to those tight bond markets and gaps in private sector funding and liquidity. And so it's a design so that FHA and HFAs share in the risk of a mortgage. And it actually was very successful before it was phased out. I think the numbers, something over or close to $1,500 financed $1,500 loans, and close to it was a little over, I think, 9 billion. And so there was a real impact that the program was able to make. So it was largely, I think, very successful in anybody who really looks at it. Under the previous administration, as you mentioned, the program was allowed to basically expire. So it ended December 31st, 2019, under the previous administration. But one of the things for NALFA coming in was this program. So in our initial discussions with HUD, when we were initially contacting them, both in the transition from the previous administration and the new administration, this is one of those things that we were saying should be an immediate priority for HUD to reinstate. The intel that we've been hearing about this, and there's no official announcements or anything from HUD or the administration at this point, but the intel that we've been receiving is that sometime around the fall, so maybe October-ish, HUD is looking to reinstate this. Now, so as I said, there's no official announcements, and President Biden and Secretary Fudge have not made public statements about the program and their support for them, although I think there is a very favorable climate at HUD for this type of program. So even though there haven't been any formal announcements from them or them weighing in on the program particularly, I do think that there is some optimism there. And like I said, the kind of back channel info, that we've been receiving is sometime in the fall for that. So we're going to continue to push that and advocate strongly for the reinstatement of that. And hopefully we'll have some good news to share very soon on that.
That's great. And Kevin, you've touched on throughout the discussion, you've touched on so many issues. You're giving us a whole lot of, important information. Let's talk about on the legislative side, if you could give us more of a perspective on where the House and Senate are generally. What does the balance of power look like? Yeah,
that's a good question. So some of this is info I'm sure people know, so I'll try to maybe give some of the deeper, level beyond just the surface, things that people know. So, of course, the Democrats are in control currently of both the House and Senate. An observation that I'd like to make from this past election is the Democrats in the House actually did lose a few seats. Their majority before 2021 was actually higher than it is now. So they lost, I think it's 9. Or no, the majority that they have is 9 seats. So it's a very slim majority that they have in the House. And so that's a delicate balance there, but it's even more delicate in the Senate. Now, the Democrats, as everybody knows, are in control of the Senate again, but the Senate is split 50-50 by all intents and purposes. So talk about very, very delicate balance there. Now, since it's split 50-50, for those who might not know, the question always comes up, well, who determines who's in power and all of that? The vice president of the United States is also the president of the Senate. And so Vice President Kamala Harris is the president of the Senate. So she presides over the Senate. So she determines, a lot of things in terms of majority control and things like that. Now, she can't vote on legislation except for one particular situation in which there is a tie. If the Senate votes on something and it is 50-50, the vice president comes down to break the tie. So she can vote in instances where there's a tie on important legislation. So that's an interesting thing. Now, the Democrats, they're mostly in the House, they're mostly unified. There is definitely a little bit of a pull from the progressive wing of the caucus on Nancy Pelosi. She's trying to appease, I think, a few different people because she's got the progressive wing who are looking to really push a lot of priorities from the progressive side. But then there are members who are elected from either, the red states, swing states, and they are hearing from their constituents, don't go in that direction. So they're telling Speaker Pelosi about that. So there's kind of this, wrangling going on, but she does a pretty good job, I think, at maintaining unity in the caucus. And now in the Senate side, and I should mention too, in the House, Speaker Pelosi has been able to pass several pieces of legislation already this year. And so she was able to get unification amongst the Democrats in her caucus on that from kind of all sides. Now in the Senate, it's a little bit different. The Senate is very, very fragile, and legislation doesn't flow through the Senate the way it does in the House. So even with the Democrats in control, they have to, and this is where you'll get into the discussion about the filibuster and cloture and everything. So in the Senate, in order to move to a vote on a bill of passage, they actually have to vote once in advance on what's called cloture. And it's basically a vote to end debate so that you can proceed to a vote on passage. To end debate on a bill, you need 60 votes. So it's not a simple majority. So in order for the Democrats, now there's a couple of other circumstances I'll explain in a minute, but in order for Democrats to advance legislation in the Senate, they need to get some Republicans to join them, not necessarily even on voting yes or no on final passage, but they have to get certain Republicans to join them to end debate on pieces of legislation. And so that's a challenge. And usually the minority party will say, well, no, I'm not going to vote to end debate because I don't want to. If we do that, you're going to pass the bill because you're in the majority. So no. And that's another form of the filibuster. Sometimes we think of filibustering as you going down to the chamber and giving just a long speech and, just maintaining speech in order to stop a vote. That's a form of filibustering. But the other form of filibustering is preventing cloture votes from moving forward with 60 votes. So the Republicans do have the ability to filibuster on key pieces of legislation. So what does that mean? Well, that's why in the news, for example, on the infrastructure bill, we're seeing a lot of things about bipartisan agreements, finding areas where both parties can agree. We hear a lot about Senators Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema, who are Democrats, and they're kind of swing Democrats in the sense that they're Democrats, but they'll kind of buck party leadership in certain cases, and part of that's their constituency representing places like West Virginia and Arizona, who have a relatively strong conservative presence in the state. So all that's to say, I know it might be a little complex, but all that's to say is the balance of power is very fragile right now. I think Speaker Pelosi's done a pretty good job at maintaining unity in the caucus there. I think there's been a lot of effort in the Senate side to keep Senators Manchin and Sinema in particular, keeping them happy, keeping them aligned with the caucus. And I don't think, the last point I'll mention, because sometimes people ask about filibuster reform. Will there be, efforts to move forward on filibuster reform? I don't think that's going to happen. Both of them, both Sinema and Manchin, oppose that. All of the Republicans oppose it. So there's just no way that they'd be able to move forward with rules to change that. So those are just some insights there, and I kind of nerded out for a second. So, but
no, that's great. No, that's great. NALFA has been a supporter of the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act, which would make reforms to the low-income housing tax credit. Give us a little background on that and the status of the legislation, and does it have a chance of passing this year?
Yeah, that's an important bill. So this bill has been introduced in Congress now for several years. It's something that NALFA has been working on with several other industry advocates on a lot of these issues. Now, I mentioned too in my earlier remarks that in the COVID relief bill that was passed in December, they did include the permanent 4% rate in that bill in December, and that was one of the important provisions in the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act as recently as the last Congress. So now with that though being done, there's now more of an effort to focus on some of the other provisions that would reform the low-income housing tax credit. For example, the biggest one now is increasing the annual credit allocation by 50%. Some other things are trying to stimulate more development.
Yes, I like the fish sandwich meal with a large sweet tea. No, medium fries. And could you add an apple fritter also?
Is that Ralph? Ralph,
Yes.
if you could mute yourself. I think we're good, Kevin.
Okay. So yeah, 50% credit allocation, more developments that serve extremely low income, housing credit development for veterans. So there's a few other things that are in this legislation. So, but the 50% allocation is going to be, I think, that's kind of the big one that's in there right now. Since again, the 4% is out of the way from the last time. So the bill right now, there's two bills, one in the House, one in the Senate. The Senate bill, it's Senate Bill 1136 that currently had, and that was introduced by Maria Cantwell. That has 19 co-sponsors. Excuse me. And the House bill, HR 2573, that has currently 63 co-sponsors. But what I want to point out, it's still it's only been a couple of months since that was introduced, and that's actually a decent co-sponsor number for a bill that's only been around now for a couple of months. In the last Congress, there were, I think, maybe 200 something co-sponsors in the House, and I forget the exact number in the Senate for the last time, but they were for piece of legislation to have that level of bipartisan support is pretty incredible, and so that's been great. It's been great too getting Republican support for this legislation. There's been a lot of Republicans who have been supporting this legislation for a number of years. So that's been very positive, just to get a real bipartisan, coalition kind of together in Congress who are advocating for this. So in terms of chances of passing, I think there is a chance, but I think what's going to have to happen is this legislation will have to get tacked onto something bigger, like an infrastructure bill, in order to pass. And a lot of cases, and this is just the nature of the politics on the Hill, this would be considered a smaller bill because it's a niche issue. It's not like a comprehensive energy bill or infrastructure bill or housing bill. It's a narrowly focused piece of legislation, and in many cases it's very, very difficult to pass standalone pieces of legislation with that amount of scope. So it's really going to come down to something like the infrastructure bill as the vehicle. I know for NALFA's other partners in this space, other organizations who advocate for this, seems to be consensus that the infrastructure bill coming up is going to be really the real opportunity excuse me, to pass something into law this year on this. So we're going to keep advocating very strongly for that, and but I think that's going to be the window that we have this year to get that through.
Sounds good. So then you led into the infrastructure legislation, talking
Right.
about the need, to tack on this smaller bill to that. So where do things stand with the infrastructure bill today? And do you think there's a chance that we do something there? And what are the other, are there other items of interest within it that are important to NALFA and to the housing arena?
Great question. So what I wanted to do is talk a little bit about, I'm going to start with Biden. Now, the president has been supportive of infrastructure as a as something to do this year from both the perspective of we need to make meaningful investments into things like surface transportation and things like that. So roads, bridges, air, rail infrastructure, things like that. But the president has been supportive of proposals to deal with really critical housing programs. And on the screen is what you'll see is some numbers that President Biden has released on where he'd like to see housing programs in an infrastructure package. So, for example, tenant-based rental assistance in the context of infrastructure, he's asked for 30.4 billion. You can see the other ones: home investment partnerships 1.9, CDBG 3.8, fair housing 85 million. So he's really asking for a pretty robust investment into housing programs. So we think that's positive. Now, what I wanted to report on was some of the recent discussions that have been happening. So the Republicans they were previously negotiating with Senator Shelley Moore Capito from the state of West Virginia. She was kind of the Republican representative with the White House on trying to find some common ground. Generally speaking, the Republicans are in favor of a much more narrow approach to infrastructure. So when they hear infrastructure, they're thinking roads, bridges, maybe some rail, maybe some airport, upgrading some airports, some ports, maritime ports, and that's kind of it. That's maybe some broadband, rural broadband, but they're really seeing infrastructure in more of that narrow way versus the Democrats, especially the more progressive side of the caucus. They want to see a real holistic approach to infrastructure. They want to see housing. They want to see clean energy, climate change language in an infrastructure bill. They want to see a lot included. They're looking like, hey, this is a chance to get something through. Let's really make this meaningful. Let's include a lot of things. So that's kind of the disagreement, and it's a matter of kind of finding where are we going to be in the middle, to make everybody happy to get a deal. Historically, and by historically I mean over the past few months, they've had a hard time finding some common ground on some things. Now, there was some recent reporting this week that there was a deal reached between Republicans and Democrats in Congress that President Biden is supportive of. Unfortunately, right now, that proposal doesn't seem to reflect affordable housing programs or any housing programs for that matter. So that's something that we're a little concerned about. What I have here is just a couple of the latest numbers. The details of this package are very slim. There's not a lot of detail except for some high numbers, but the deal would be something like 500 billion if it were to move forward as currently outlined. It would be about $500 billion. It's mostly surface transportation related. And as I mentioned, there isn't anything in there for housing, but we're working right now with some of the other organizations that do federal advocacy on these issues and looking at ways to really make the case to the Democrats in Congress and to President Biden that we really need them to step up to the plate on supporting these programs. Secretary Fudge and the president have supported housing, and they've made statements saying, look, we think infrastructure is really going to be the vehicle to get a lot of these programs moving forward, including those reforms to the housing credit and some others. So we're going to be really urging them to step up on that. So that's kind of the latest on infrastructure. But generally speaking, I'll just add lastly that it does really seem like this year, if there's going to be an infrastructure bill at all, this year would probably be the right year to do it. Next year, what's going to happen is it's going to be a campaign year. All the members are going to go into campaign mode. We have the midterm elections coming up in which the Democrats, in a way, are kind of on the defensive, just looking at the last several administrations and how in a midterm election, the House of Representatives has been flipping back to the minority party. So the Democrats are playing some defense there. So they're going to be focused a lot, I think, on campaigning next year. And this year is really going to be their opportunity to get something through on infrastructure if they can find some agreements and come together on that. So we're just going to continue to work on that and really make the case that these critical housing programs need to be included in a package.
Kevin, this has really been great. You've given us a wealth of information on on your work, on NALFA's priorities. I know there are probably other issues, but I wanted to, Mark, I wanted to ask if at this time you wanted Kevin to go on with the discussion, or do we have any questions? I haven't been monitoring the chat.
There's a
but-
couple of questions that were sent to me. Kevin, which members from Florida in the House or Senate are on the committees that are the most relevant to either tax credits or to housing funding? Which are the ones that would be our priorities to target?
Sure, yeah. So, excuse me, on the Democratic side, Al Lawson is on House Financial Services. So House Financial Services is going to be on the House side, an important committee. So that's chaired by Maxine Waters. They have jurisdiction over housing programs, HUD, things like that. That's not to say that appropriations is the other important committee, but starting with financial services, Al Lawson right now is the only Democrat from Florida. But on the Republican side, you've got Bill Posey, who is, yeah. Just to let you know who's there, we got Bill Posey, and I think those are the Floridians on financial services. On appropriations, I'm just pulling up the roster real quick just to make sure I have my info right. Appropriations is in some ways, it's a much more influential committee. Debbie Wasserman Schultz is on the House Appropriations Committee, and she might be. Congresswoman Frankel is on the Appropriations Committee. Charlie Crist is on Appropriations. So on the Democratic side, there's pretty decent representation on appropriations. On the Senate side, if you want to talk about the Senate side real quick.
Yes, thanks.
Yeah. Excuse me. So I don't think, Marco Rubio is on appropriations, but on the Republican side. On Senate, the other important committee is kind of the counter committee to House Financial Services is the Senate Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs Committee. That's chaired by Sherrod Brown from Ohio. And I don't think any Floridians are on that committee, but that would be the other important committee. So, but definitely on appropriations, there's some really good representation for Florida there, which is a great thing.
Great. And the follow-up question is, what's our ask right now? What if people, some of our members know they're members of Congress, and if they, what is it that we're going to encourage them? And then in a follow-up, I'll go back and monitor Sherry to see if there's anything else. If someone wants to meet with their representative or staff in Washington, can you help set up those meetings?
Great. Thanks, Mark. Great questions. I'll take them backwards. Yes, we will absolutely help anybody who would like to meet with their members of Congress. More than happy to assist with that. And while these questions are going on, what I'm going to do, just to make it convenient for everybody, is I'm going to share Jonathan and my contact information. Sorry, 1 second here. Let me get the right thing. Because this way, people can have our email address if you'd like to contact us. There we go. So more than happy to help anybody who would like information, or if you'd like an introduction to your member, happy to do that. The other question in terms of ask. So right now, the way we're looking at what would be the best thing to focus on for asks is what has the best chance of passing, where are we really going to find some opportunities. One of them is definitely asking for them to support and co-sponsor the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act. And so we talked about that a little bit before. And the big meat of that is going to be that 50% allocation. So because I mentioned the 4% was addressed last December, that's going to be a really strong ask for us in the coming months, especially. The other one is going to be to support really critical housing programs, especially as we come out of COVID. So things like rental assistance, home funding, things like that, things that are really going to strengthen these programs. And as I mentioned too, the fact that we're looking at appropriations for the first year that will not be hindered by the Budget Control Act, there's a real opportunity to make some substantive investments into these programs. So I think asking members of Congress to not shy away from really funding these programs at really significant levels is going to be important. So those would be, I think, the two main congressional asks. We could talk about, on the regulatory side, that's a little bit more tricky, but support for AFFH is going to be a big one moving forward, disparate impact. And when the time comes, support for the HUD FFB risk sharing partnership, which we'll hopefully have some more information on that coming up soon.
Is that all you have, Mark?
Yes, I'm sorry. That was all we have, Sherry. So,
Okay.
back-
Well,
back.
well, we want to thank both Kevin for his awesome presentation today, and Jonathan for his presence from NALFA. I wanted to also indicate that both W.D. Morris and myself, we sit on the board of NALFA. It has proven, very enriching for us. We're grateful for the support that we have on the federal level. And, we would like to urge any of our Florida peers to join us as well. And we want to thank them for the work that they do and for always being there to support Florida Alpha in the work that we do here on the state level. And Mark, Kevin, if you want to give us some closing remarks, and then we'll turn it back over to Mark.
Oh, just briefly, just want to say thank you to Florida Alpha for all of you for joining today. I want to thank Mark for asking us to join and for being a great host for us. And thank you to Sherry for being such a great moderator, keeping all my thoughts aligned. So just want to say a heartfelt thank you to all of you.
Thank you, Jonathan and Kevin. Kevin, great presentation. That was really, really substantive. Thank you so much. And anyone who thinks of questions afterwards, if you email them to any of us, we'll try to get them answered and distributed. Reminder to everyone to make sure you register for the conference. I know that we've sent around ways for you to get on here without registering, but if you register, you get the goodies when we do the Starbucks day, where we'll be sending out gift cards to everyone who's actually registered. And lastly, Sherry, thank you so much for organizing the panel and your work with NALFA and Florida Alpha. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And just for everyone, reminder, next Tuesday, June 29th, noon to 1, we have our Florida legislative update, where it is chock full. We'll have Sarah Bascom from Bascom Communications, Ken Pruitt, former Senate president, our lead lobbyist, and Jamie Ross with the Florida Housing Coalition. We'll be talking about what happened in the last session, and also we'll be talking about something hot off the press, a proposed constitutional amendment that the realtors are pushing related to putting housing funding directly into the Constitution of Florida. So a lot to talk about. And Sherry, and unless you've got anything else, we'll sign off and say thank you.
Yes, thanks so much. Nothing else from here. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.